Hello and welcome to the Madecast, the official podcast of the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment, a series of lectures on video game history as part of the Made's ongoing effort to preserve history through teaching and displaying playable exhibits of rare games and consoles.
While life in the time of COVID has forced us to close our doors, the support of people like you has allowed us to continue to bring history to you through lectures like the one you'll hear in a few minutes. I'm Chin.
I'm Miles.
I'm Anthony.
And I'm Red. Hello. This week, our guest is none other than Steve Horowitz, sound director for Nickelodeon Digital, musician, and a shared professor of ours at San Francisco State. We hear him, we talk with him about, Alex talks with him about his history in games and how he got to start making music and recording voiceovers for different games back in the day. But first, before we get into those conversations, we get into the news. And Sony, back at it again.
It's you again, Sony.
So Anthony made us aware that Sony has done a bit of a reversal, 2 out of 3 reversal. So you want to bring us up to speed on that?
Yeah, so through a serious twist of fate here, looks like all of our prayers and thoughts have been answered. Mm-hmm. Sony will not be closing down the PlayStation Store for the PS Vita and the PS3.
Yay! Woo! Round of applause, everybody. Round of applause.
We did it, everyone. But unfortunately, they're going to shut down the PlayStation Store for the PSP. So if you are a PSP owner and still looking to purchase digital games or movies, now's the time to do so.
Or stock up on those, the physical, the UMDs. Those are fun. Mm-hmm. I like those a lot. With other news in the moment, Discord has stopped their talks with Microsoft for the $10 billion acquisition. So we will see what becomes of Discord in the future. Who may take it up? Maybe Yahoo will take them up as well.
I think they just like to stay independent as if they're doing now. I would hope so. It's a smart idea to just having reports of a $10 billion talk acquisition with Microsoft. So just talking about that.
That's going to drive interest. That's going to drive interest, and I think that really, from the little I understand of the financial world, it sounds like they're gearing up for an IPO at this point.
That would be nice. We'll see. We'll see.
The same happened to Unity last year, and
how'd it go?
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. I do have some friends make some money from there, but yeah.
I have friends that make money there, but that's about it. In other news, the Mortal Kombat movie is coming out. For all reports, this is looking like a good product for what it is. I'm not going to say it's an Oscar winner, but I'm also not going to not say it's an Oscar winner. But it's looking pretty fun. It's looking very Mortal Kombat, I will say that.
I watched the trailer and I thought, this movie looks dumb, but it's Mortal Kombat. I'm not going to expect really too much more from it.
No. It's not going to be anything incredibly crazy.
Yeah, I'll go check it out.
Yes. Maybe we can do
report back
a little Madecast excursion.
Madecast movie night.
To a movie theater. Yes. We shall see in the future. Before we, I think it's about time we wrap up talking about the news at the moment, so we can throw it on over to Alex and Steve in this great interview that they had, and we got to have a little chat with our former professor. So without further ado, Steve Horowitz.
Hello, and we are back here with Steve Horowitz, longtime Made supporter and audio engineer.
Hello, Alex. Good to be here with you. I didn't know that was my prompt to say hello. Good to be here with you.
Well, that's all right. You don't, as we said, you don't do voiceover work. You just edit the voiceover work and edit the music and make the music and all those things, right?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to go into the, I've done tons of voiceover recording over the years, and I've had the opportunity to go into the booth, and I've never wanted to do that ever. just because I have so much respect for good voiceover people, and it's such hard work. It's really hard work.
We had Chris Brown on the show last couple weeks ago, and she does a lot of voiceover work, coaching and so forth, and she was mentioning that. But I wanted to sort of start with where you got into video games, because you were a musician first, correct?
I still am a musician, Alex.
Well, yes, of course, you're still a musician.
Boy.
But I mean, your musicianhood predates your involvement with video games, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I started out, as a guitar player, and then I switched over to bass, and I was playing in bands, and I was doing recording, and I studied a little bit. I went down to the California Institute of the Arts and studied music down there, and actually, that was all pre any involvement with game audio or game sound. And I came back up to San Francisco, and a good friend of mine now, who I just met at the time, Mark Miller, my cousin was in town, introduced me to Mark. I think Mark's like the first recipient of the Gang Gang Lifetime Achievement Awards, anyway. But so I met Mark. And actually, we were at some club in San Francisco, and he was screaming at me. He's like, "Did you ever think about making your living making music for games?" And I'm like, "No." And he got me my start, and his company, Neuromantic Productions, they were working for everybody from Sega, Sony, Crystal Dynamics, and I got a major education following him around. And this was back in the day of Sound Blaster cards, when people had PCs but had no idea how they could make sound and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I start, right about 1991.
Okay, so what was your first title?
That's a really good question. I probably don't remember actually what the first one was, but the most memorable first one was working with Rocket Science Games on Cadillacs and Dinosaurs.
Indeed, and that was a sort of an IP property. It was this weird sort of everything at once kind of property. It was a cartoon and a video game, and
yeah, it was very similar to a lot of what was happening at that time. CD-ROM had just come in, and suddenly we went from 6 megabytes for a game to like 500 megabytes. And so we recorded live music, and we mixed that with MIDI stuff, and it was all combined together. But Rocket Science was an interesting company because they started out, was supposed to be, we're going to make 2 games this year, and 4 the next, and 8 the next. And then they made 2 games that technically were quite impressive, but not super impressive to the game playing community. And then that was they started to go downhill from there. But I remember going out to Rocket Science Games. Their offices were in the East Bay, and they had catered lunches every day.
Wow.
It was that merger of Silicon Valley and Hollywood. It was Sillywood, and everyone was super excited. And for me, it was great. Absolutely fantastic.
You mentioned the catered lunches. Were there any sort of any other symbols of largesse when you got there that you can remember?
They just had a lot of, they had a lot of space. What else was going on? No, not so much at the time. The only thing I found out later, much later, in fact, just recently, I think you and I talked about this, is that apparently Elon Musk was there working.
Yes, he worked there on The Legend of Tully Bodine.
Right, and that was, I didn't work specifically on that title, but I had, other friends of mine who were working, on that, and I never met him and never knew he was there, and it was only recently I found out that he was actually in the building.
Was that, did they have all that space because they were doing filming on site?
I don't know. I think they were doing mocap there. They were doing all sorts of things. It was one of those games, very typical for the early '90s, where there were every single level was precursed by a fully animated cutscene. You know, and this was taken from the Schultz story, and it was fully done with voiceover and sound design. I think actually Chris Grieg from Negativland did the sound effects and sound design. And they were fully produced. I recorded live instruments and mixed and mastered and did the whole thing. and so those were like full on productions, and then the gameplay itself was, sort of secondary in a way.
A lot of those games sort of felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen it. You drive around in this car that's very hard to control, and basically run into dinosaurs.
But it still sounds like one of those sort of crucible moments in history where all these really cool people came together and were in the same place, whether or not the thing was a success. Like Krautrock came out of sort of a thing like this. I consider Noisebridge in San Francisco to be similar to that. Like, did it feel that way? Was there an energy to it?
Absolutely. There was an energy to San Francisco at that time, right? Because you didn't just have rocket science, but there were multiple companies, big companies like Sega and Sony, Crystal Dynamics, that were all, doing new things and doing interesting things and very much, producing all sorts of games. And then at the same time, you also had like mom and pop companies. Like I remember we worked on a project for a 2-person company. It was just a husband and wife team who lived in Tiburon, and they wanted to do Dante's Inferno on CD-ROM. And we recorded. I recorded all of Dante's Inferno in the studio for them with voice actors, very British voice actors doing the whole thing, and it was. I never saw the light of day. I don't think it ever came out. It was just such a gigantic project. But the excitement in those days was that all of a sudden, again, we went from 6 megs to 500 megs, and there was the chance to put all sorts of, rich media, right? Mm-hmm. That couldn't be done before. And yeah.
Now, I know you mentioned Mark Miller, but I mean, there's a lot of other people that sort of came up in the 90s who are now in that audio space and, made some of these classic songs that people harken back to in the classic games. How is that transition, do you think, going for yourself and your peers from that era of, woohoo, we have a lot of storage space, to now this, we're doing a lot of reissues of this old stuff. We're doing a lot of remasters of old stuff. You can just make whatever music you want and put it on any game because of encoding technology. It seems like the constraints are gone, and there's an established sort of oeuvre, as it were.
Well, you would think so, but people such as myself who have been around for a while, we just talk about how the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the game world in general, and the game business in general, and game industry is so circular and so cyclic, right? Yeah, great. You've got your PS4s, you've got your PS5s, you've got your Xboxes, and at the same time, you still need to make your stuff work for mobile devices, right? Which may have, computing power and audio processing that's, equivalent with, 1990s or, mid 90s tech. So, there's always consideration for file size. There's always consideration for what can be done. And, the only thing that's fascinating for me is that, we did a lot of 8-bit, audio at that time, right? Having to take things and convert them down, to make them fit onto the platforms. And now all of my students, and there's a whole younger generation that are just like, chiptunes rock. And I'm like, this is great. Listen to that crunch. And I'm all like, oh my God, we tried to run as fast as we could away from that to go to higher fidelity and higher quality. So it's interesting.
Is that surprising to you? Maybe the fact that these older platforms and this lack of quality is what is sought now? Or, I mean, that's already happened in the audio world before.
Yeah. You know what? It is, but it shouldn't be, right? Like, I should have known. It's like I should have known to save every single comic book I bought when I was a kid and put it in a plastic bag. I should have known that they would be super worth a lot. Like, I have friends who did that, and they their collections are worth like $50,000, and I have 4 that might be worth something, right? So similar. It's like I was not thinking about it that way. Maybe there were people who were thinking about it in terms of posterity. I was just thinking, I really love what's going on with games. I love the technology. I love the, the arcane systems that are being used. And so I found myself falling into using my musicality in those ways. And then I found it super, super interesting. So I never thought, oh my gosh, 20 years from now, I never even gave it a thought that people would be looking back and remembering and being nostalgic about that kind of stuff. But, in retrospect, of course I should have, right? Because you've got a whole generation of people who have grown up, and that's the stuff they love. That's the stuff they grew up on. So of course they're going to want to go back to it and to emulate it.
So I was going to hand it over to our production staff here, who your former students, who I'm sure have interesting questions for you, and hopefully they'll let you talk about your new projects too.
Oh, interesting.
I guess I'll go first. So you talked a little bit about sort of the transition from the past to now, and the changes that took place in that transition. Which do you think was more sort of the Wild West? Like, was the past was like your early career sort of just this like anything goes, we'll figure it out? Or do you think that it sort of developed into a more stable structure, or it's become less stable?
Well, if I had to answer, I mean, I would say more stable, but with the caveat that it's still the Wild West, depending on what area of the game industry you're working in, right? So, okay, early days back in the 90s, that was the Wild Wild West. That was like people didn't know what sound cards can do. People weren't sure what the platforms can do. Then you cut to when the mobile thing really blew up in the 2000s. It was the same deal. It's like, how do we get sound onto the headset? How do we make this work? They didn't even know the specs for individual devices, right? And that's happening again now as we move into VR, right? 6 degrees of separation and ambisonic sound and all sorts of new things to learn. So on one level, very much like the film industry, there's been enough time to codify it. And the bigger companies that are working in the AAA space, they're much less like the Wild Wild West right now, and much harder for people to break into, and things have been settled. But there are always these new technologies, new platforms, and things that maybe we didn't even consider to be game-like, right? Coming out all the time. And those always present opportunities. So it's a little bit of both. iOS is easier, right? They always seem to have a clear development path. Android is getting better, but just speaking in general, not outside of mobile in general, there's always the challenges are, I think, in some ways similar, right? Is like, how do we make really great sounding stuff? And how do we we're artists, right? So how do we apply our artistic sensibilities at the same time trying to keep up with a lot of the new technology? Yeah, it's a challenge, right? So, you're constantly, you need to be fearless in a certain way, and you're constantly being thrown into the water, into the deep end of the pool. So if that's not something that you like so much, then maybe working in the game industry or sound or music for games isn't so much for you. So, it's always applying the same artistic techniques and the same artistic sensibility. And then just, working closely with developers, doing your research, right? And just trying to understand the new platforms and what their capabilities are, right? It's endlessly fascinating, right? It's tech. And I actually find that part of the exciting part. But in reality, to answer the other part of your question, which is it's hard. It's hard to keep up with all of these things that are changing all of the time.
I got a question, but I don't ask it for myself. I have been meeting a lot of people who are musicians like us, and they have been looking into the game audio world, and they start got frustrated because they have never done something like game design or even mixing or mastering. Mm-hmm. So as a musician like us, what kind of advice would you give them to get a start on touching something that they have not been feeling comfortable with?
Yeah, and I think you, having having spent some time with me, I think you know where my answer is going to be with this. Is that, when I started out back in the day, there was no middleware, right? There were no third-party plugin companies. Every company was making its own tools, right? Then you got into this course of where it's like, okay, great, and there was nowhere to go to school for it, right? There was nowhere to study, right? You just started doing it, or like me, you started working with somebody who had a company who was doing it, who knew a whole lot more than you, and you kind of interned with them in that way while you were working, right? So, the cut to now, or, cut as we go forward in time, it became more important, and everyone started talking about middleware, right? So it was like, oh, you need to know Fmod, you need to know Wise. Okay, yeah. Great. So it's a given that you can, use a digital audio workstation and make things sound really, really good. That's like the base level, right? As a musician, you need to understand how to orchestrate, how to compose, how to do all of that stuff, whether in the box or outside of the box, right? With live musicians or not with live musicians. I mean, those are the base skills that we all have to have. And then you go to the next level and it's like, well, okay, I can use some middleware. I can use Fmod. I can use Wise. And understanding how those programs work is very, very difficult without taking that third step, which is working inside of a game engine. And what I've been finding, and what we've been finding through the Game Audio Institute and other places, is it's essential. And companies now, if you start to look at job listings for jobs in mostly in AAA, they are asking now not just for, musical skills or sound design skills, but they also want you to be a technical sound designer and know middleware and implementation. And further, they want you to have experience inside of game engines. So that's, I think, a change that's happened over the course of many, many years, going from, oh, you just need to be a musician, to, oh, now you need to know these other things, which makes a lot of sense, actually, because in games, how can we create really great music and really great sound if we don't understand how the game functions, right?
Yeah.
So, you've heard me say that a million times, and I'm broken record about that.
Yeah, I just have to ask for some of the other people who asked me about it. I mean, I think you're a better person to explain this kind of stuff for me.
Yeah, I think the big thing that you have to keep in mind is that, okay, back in the day, we would get calls from people. Mark would get calls at Neuromantic from, TV composers or film composers. And they're great composers. And they'd be like, oh, I hear this game thing's really great. I don't really like games, but I need money. And that's just that's a non-starter right there, right? What the game industry needs from music and sound to make good stuff is people who are great artists and at the same time understand the tools and understand the devices that they're working, that they're making, their art for. So, it's one of those things where that keeps evolving and keeps changing, and the benchmark gets moved. But, it's very rare. It's not impossible, but it's very rare that you find people in the game industry who's like, I just write music. I just write music and I orchestrate, and that's what I do. They do exist, but there are handfuls of them out there compared to the number of people who are involved in all the technical side as well, right? Understanding music and sound, but also able to, use middleware, and it's just what sort of is required these days. Oh gosh, in game in game world or in other things, or yeah. Oh, well, let's see. On the game side, so I still audio direct with Nickelodeon Digital, which is the games division, and there's a couple of really exciting things that are happening there. One is the emerging products team has been working on Google and Alexa and Amazon voice activated games, which are very interesting and very new. So there's been a series of Blues Clues and You that has come out. I worked on a lot of kids games. I do work on a lot of kids games. And so those are cool. And it's an interesting rethink of how we make games that are audio only games, right? Games that, there's no visuals, or if there are, actually some of the devices are starting to have visuals as well, but they're not the richest yet. So that's really cool. The other thing is SpongeBob Patty Pursuit, which came out for the Apple Arcade and was a #1 game for a while. So that's been a nice project to work on. And along the lines of education, been delving more into that with the Game Audio Institute, and we've started to teach classes online, as well as specifically to keep developing new game lessons, that we call them, which are Unity projects that have been wired up to teach specific things in terms of sound design, in terms of music implementation, so all those things keep going forward in game world, and are super interesting.
How do people find your audio classes and so forth?
Oh, they can go to the GameAudioInstitute.com. Or just Google Game Audio Institute, and you'll see me and my co-founder Scott Looney. And you can read a little bit about what we're doing there with schools. Right now at San Francisco State, we're developing we're developing a bunch of new programs in music for visual media. And so it's one of the few places in the country, I would say, probably maybe the only place in the country where you can get a 4-year liberal arts degree and a degree in music with an emphasis in music and sound for games. Yeah. And the other thing I was going to tell you about, I have 2 albums that came out recently of my, and one of them is an album of duets that I did with me on bass and Vinny Golia on saxophone, Michael John Fink on guitar, Ben Saby doing electronics and synthesis, and a solo bass album that just came out over the pandemic summer of last summer, where nobody could get together and play with each other. So
what are the album titles, Steve?
One is called Duets, and the other is called Bass Solos, and both of them you can find if you go to stevehorowitzmusic.com. Of course, always happy to.
And thank you for supporting The Maid for all these years.
The Maid is the best. If you're listening to this and you're not supporting The Maid, you should be supporting The Maid. It's essential, vital, and wonderful.
Thank you very much.
And welcome back. Thank you very much, Steve. We are very happy that you were able to come in and talk with us again, and it's good to see your face, even though digitally. We shall see it.
Wish I haven't graduated.
I know. I mean, you can always go back and take the class.
The cards always become better when you leave it.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. It was thank you very much, Steve, for coming by, and we'll see you soon and talk about more things in the future. So, now that we're back together, what games have y'all been playing? I've been playing Final Fantasy 15, and it's been fun, but I want to hear what you've been playing.
I'm actually curious what you think of it.
Okay. I enjoy it. It's really fun. The combat, I would recommend doing it. Trying to find a right pace is rough in the game, because I think I leveled up too quickly, and so some of the fights have been seemingly very easy, but they are now starting to get harder again. I'm unaware of quite how many chapters there are in the game. I'm in chapter 5, I believe, but I'm gonna be over level 50. Put a few, I think about 35 hours so far total into it. Just grinding a lot of the hunts. It's fun. The fighting is fun. the traveling pace kind of gets me a little bit. It's a little bit slow for me, but I mean, I get it. It's idyllic, and it's encapsulating 4 bros taking a road trip together in the midst of a massive war. So
by that, do you mean that the car itself is slow, like it's physically just slow to drive, or like the
yes,
pace
like
of the game is slow and not enough is happening fast enough?
No. Like the pace of the game is very nice and freeform, and you can go check stuff out at your own pace. There's a lot to see and do. The pace, like the car physically is slow, and it says press R2 to accelerate, but it means just press R2 to go. You don't have control over the accelerator.
So it's like Skyrim horse.
No, not even that good.
Could it be you just driving too fast in your real life, so you feel like it's slow in the game?
Well, it limits me.
Read the speed demon.
Limits me. Yes. Hey, I'm not a speed demon. I'm just like, but this is a video game. I mean, I don't drive crazy on the freeway, but in a video game, there's no risk. It's supposed to be freedom, but we'll see. It's fine. It's a very fun game. I like the story. It's visually gorgeous. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing, I really enjoy it. It's super fun.
Do you find like a sort of overlap between the combat system between Kingdom Hearts?
Yes. It's very similar, like flowy style of where you can go back and forth. It's a little, I actually kind of like it a little bit. For Kingdom Hearts 3, there's definitely a bit of an overlap because you like this switching weapons is an interesting ability that you can do, is because you can like switch weapons mid attack. So that I now in retrospect see that, but it's I don't know. I really the aesthetic in the Final Fantasy game is really awesome. It's honestly, I'm getting a bit of Monster Hunter vibes from it. Just because of the amount, there's a lot of hunting wild animals and monsters, if you will, and there's a whole different it's not as in depth of a combat system, but there's for each weapon, but there's a lot of different weapons that do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. So. It feels like that, but just with a Final Fantasy story behind it and a fancy car that a prince drives around in with his 4 bodyguards. But it's very cool. I just got the first summon, but it's not as clean as this Final Fantasy VII remake summons. Like, you don't have as much freedom to summon them whenever. It's almost kind of like a random encounter that sometimes appears on the screen. So small gripe with that, but nothing big. Mm-hmm. Anything that you guys have been playing, though? Enough about Final Fantasy 15.
Well, despite me have been gathering rocks and strawberries in Final Fantasy 14 for a whole day, I have been putting my eyes in...
You gather Starburst in the game?
Yeah.
Is that a brand deal?
I mean... There are a lot of crafter and gatherer jobs in Final Fantasy 14, and okay. I have to make something in that game, so I do grind for a day for it.
Well, yeah.
And I have been just fishing, gathering some fruits like strawberries, or something like mineral water.
Nice.
And yeah, there's just a tons of them.
I've also been doing some fishing in Final Fantasy 15.
Oh yeah, so. Right.
Oh yeah, that part I enjoy. And they put it in there, and then all of your guys around you, it's like, are you really having fun? Why do you do this? And I'm like, what? Why?
No, you don't
why
understand.
Put it in the game and then shit on me?
It's fun.
Poop on me.
It's fun.
Bleep it out. Mute me out. Dang it.
I'm going to have a hard take here. I have never had fun in any fishing minigame ever.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
I agree with Miles on that.
What? You guys don't like fishing?
Every fishing minigame I've ever played has been just so boring or needlessly convoluted or just really stupid hard and doesn't make any sense. It's just not a fun mechanic for me.
You may laugh about it, but I even enjoy fishing in Minecraft.
No, fishing is Oh, fishing is fun. The better the fishing mini game, the better the game.
I'm not joking. I can fish a whole day in Minecraft. I used to do that.
I could do a lot of fishing. I mean, maybe not necessarily a whole day on this one, but there was a good fishing sim in another. Oh, fishing in Hades is fun, and you can't knock that. It's a good mechanic. It's very simple, and you get special shiny things. So, but okay. We'll talk about a fish. We'll have this fishing sim debate later.
Madecast fishing trip.
Yes.
To go with movie night.
Madecast fishing trip. Yes. But pre-movie night, we have a Madecast fishing trip, and then come back and watch a movie. What are we watching? Jaws. Okay.
It's a good movie.
Yes.
Very dated.
Dated. Okay. Anyway, I think we are running out of time for this episode of the Madecast, but we want to thank you for listening, the listener, to the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment's official podcast. If you've got any thoughts, questions, corrections, or general museum ideas, please shoot us an email at info@themade.org.
We'd like to send out a big thank you to everyone who donated recently and to our Patreon supporters who keep the Made afloat. Patreon donors get to listen to this podcast 1 week before it's released on major streaming services, and we'll continue that with future episodes every week. Till then, I'm Miles.
I'm Red.
I'm Chen.
I'm Anthony, and thanks. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
See you next time.
See ya.
Later, gamers.